Hi, I'm Kira Dulaney of Kira Designs, and I'm here to show some tips and tricks for a pattern collection that I designed in collaboration with Missouri Star. This series is all about hybrid crochet, which is also called Tunisian Crochet, and it is a really nice skill builder. So we're going to start with a bandana cowl or a scarf to learn the basics. Then there's going to be a striped chevron blanket, and then finally a lacy top, which is a really nice first crochet garment if you've never made one before. So let's get started. So for this project, you're going to need a few supplies and tools, and the most important thing is going to be a special crochet hook. These are called usually Tunisian crochet hooks, sometimes Afghan crochet hooks, and the key to that is they need to either be a long hook or a interchangeable hook with a cord on it, and I'm going to show you how to put this together. This is a kit that has all the different sizes, which is really nice if you get into the craft, especially when you start worrying about gauge. It's good to have all the hooks with you. So these cords come in different lengths. I'm going to use a shorter one today because we don't really need a long cord. When I get to the blanket, you'll see me put a bigger one on. And it screws in. And then there are little stoppers that you can put on the end. Eventually, I'm going to have a lot of loops on my hook, which is a feature of this particular craft. So I do need a longer hook to hold all the loops, and a stopper is nice to make sure that none of them fall off. Now, if you are a little nervous about things coming unscrewed, they do come with a little tightener that you can use to tighten them a bit more than you can do just with your hands. It's not required, but it can be nice to make sure that everything's super secure. I am using today a J hook, which is a 6mm, and I'm actually going to use this for all three projects, even though I'm using different weights of yarn. Today we're working with a DK weight yarn, and with the J hook, it gives it kind of a solid fabric, but with a little bit of movement and drape to it, which is just perfect. I'm also going to need, eventually, a darning needle to sew up the seam and tuck in the yarn tails, and a pair of scissors. I brought a tape measure too. This particular project gauge isn't really important, but I will show you how to check gauge, because as you work through the series, it gets more and more important to make sure that you're on gauge. Now the yarn I've got is Twisted Ambitions. It's their Wicked DK, which is a superwash merino wool that also gives it a nice amount of drape for the project. And this is a really nice one for variegated yarns. Personally, I don't do a lot of crocheting with variegated yarns because I find they can kind of puddle the colors and get a little camouflage looking and blotchy. But with the hybrid crochet, also known as Tunisian crochet, the colors land really nicely because you use just a little bit of yarn on the forward pass and just a little bit of yarn on the return pass, so you don't get big blotches of colors. So if you are a crocheter with a lot of variegated yarn at home, this can be a great project to try it out if you didn't like it in more traditional crochet stitches, since they take up more yarn per stitch with the taller stitches. Now, I want to take a second and talk about the name of the craft, because you've heard me say a few different names for it already. This is not a super old craft, and our first recorded instances of it are in Victorian magazines, and the first name was Princess Frederick William Stitch, which is kind of an awkward name. It was also called at one point Victoria Crochet, Tricot Stitch, Railroad, Fool Stitch, Idiot Stitch, and eventually it landed on Tunisian Crochet, and that's the most common version of it right now. That said, we can find no record it's actually from Tunisia, so it seems like somebody was looking for a name that sounded new and exotic and picked a place and assigned it a craft. So I, and along with some other folks, have shifted our language a little bit to call it hybrid crochet, which felt really good to me when I found out people were using that, because for years I would say Tunisian crochet, a hybrid of knitting and crochet, since it feels a lot like it's between them. We've got a hook, but we put a lot of loops on that hook as we go through a row. You'll also hear sometimes Afghan stitch, or the hooks can be called Afghan hooks, not because it's related to the country of Afghanistan, but rather people did a lot of blankets with it at one point, and so the name kind of shifted to that for a little while. You will totally hear me say all three of those at different times because it's been called Tunisian crochet for a while, and a lot of the stitches have that specifically in the name. But I did want to explain a little bit about it because sometimes it's confusing when something has different names for it. Kits for this project are available at the link below and also at MissouriQuiltCo.com. I'm going to get started on a little sample here. I'm not going to be making the actual project because whether you are making the bandana cowl or the scarf, they are a little bit different. But I'm going to show you first a row that shows you all of the different stitches you'll be doing, and then we'll do each of the different rows that will happen. And of course the pattern tells you when to do which row and which stitches to do on each one. So I'm going to start with the foundation row. This is going to be the same for all 3 projects in the collection. We're going to start with a slip knot, where I make a circle with my yarn and pull a loop through. There are different ways of getting into a slip knot, so if you have a method you already like, feel free. The key things to look for are that the yarn tails are right next to each other, and if you pull, it disappears. If it gets tighter when you pull, you have not made a slip knot, you've made a different style of knot, and you might want to just snip off the yarn tail and try it again. I'm going to put that onto my hook and tighten up a little bit, but in general, I think you want to keep it a bit loose, especially on a foundation chain. So I like the slip knot to be a little bit loose on the hook and really all my loops so that they move easily. That'll make it easier for me to insert my hook on the next row. It's especially important on the foundation chain. Most people tend to chain too tightly, and I have absolutely seen many people over the years who made a foundation chain that was so tight that it was literally impossible for them to do the next row. And it looked perfectly neat and even, but it wasn't functional. Don't worry if things are a little bit uneven. You're hand making things, they're gonna be a little uneven. And usually once you do the next row, the old row looks just fine, and you'll notice the unevenness on the new row until you do the next row, and on and on and on. I think that handmade stuff should look handmade, so I never mind that. Now there's different ways to hold the yarn. What I do is pretty common, that I wrap it twice over my left index finger. I'm right-handed, so the hook's in my right hand. And notice how the yarn's coming over the front of my finger. That makes it easier for me. I don't have to work so hard to reach the stitch, so it's a bit more ergonomic. For the first step, I like to hold on to the bump of the slip knot, and that helps me stretch my loop open a little more so that it keeps it a little bit loose, which is helpful for you as a crocheter, as well as keeping a stretchy edge for the project. For my little sample here to show you, I'm going to do 21 stitches. I'm going to yarn over. I really wish this was called a hook under, but it got named way before I was born. But the hook dips under the yarn from the front and then draw it through. I like to rotate my hook a bit. And you'll notice as I crochet, my left hand moves, so I'm really pulling the loop off with my left hand as opposed to keeping my left hand in place and just moving my right hand, which a lot of folks do. But I always like to have some balance and to keep things moving. With both hands, that'll let me crochet a lot longer in life. I'm going to pull a bit of yarn out from my ball here because it's starting to pull away from me. And I'm going to do 21. I've already lost count, so let me show you how I like to count. All right, so I'm going to count my stitches here. The knot doesn't count, nor does the working loop, which is a loop on the hook here. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 up at the top there. I often lose track when I'm getting started, so frequently what I'll do, especially if I have a lot of stitches, is put a stitch marker every 10 or every 20 so that I can't lose track as easily and I don't have to count up really high, especially those projects that start with 100 or 200 stitches. It's a little noisy on the table, isn't it? I'm going to see if I can move that out of our way. All right, so for my sample of 21, I'm just going to double check that I've got that. All right, so here's my foundation chain. There are 2 sides to it. One is flat, kind of looks like a braid, but not exactly. If you flip it over, the other side is bumpy. We usually call this the back of the chain, but when I'm teaching, I call it the bumpy side because that's what people can recognize it as. There are 6 ways I can do this next row in terms of where I insert my hook. My preference is to go into the bumps on the back of the chain because that gives me a bottom edge that looks really nice and neat and happens to match the top edge. And for all the projects in this collection, that is really a nice detail to do. I'm going to skip the very first stitch, and that's because the loop on the hook is already coming out of that stitch, and go into the second one. I'm going to insert my hook under the bump and yarn over and draw up a loop. And again, I wish the yarn over maneuver was called a hook under. Really, the hook moves under the yarn. If you are a knitter, be careful because you're going to want to go the opposite direction because that's how we grab the yarn in knitting, including a yarn over in knitting. So if you need to think of it as hook under, feel free. I do say that a lot when I teach this especially. So I'm going to keep doing this. Notice I only skipped that 1 stitch at the beginning. Now I'm going to every stitch, yarn over and drop a loop. And I'm going to do this across my row. And I'm going to speed myself up a little bit, but you have the power to slow me down on YouTube. So if you need to hit that button or pause me while you catch up, feel free. All right, so I've got my loops on, and I'm just going to count them, especially when you're getting started. Count your loops every time you've done this forward pass, which is half of the row where I've worked from my dominant side to my dominant side, picking up loops. It's a nice time to stop and check that you've got the right number, which, especially if you're new, is a good way to know it's working when it might otherwise be hard to know if you're doing it right. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, which is perfect for my sample. This is the forward pass. I'm halfway through my row, and the other half of my row is the return pass. I've designed this collection so that the return pass is the same for all of the projects, which means you get a little bit of a rest where you know what to do because it's something you've done over and over and over. So for the return pass, I like to bunch up the stitches on my hook a little bit so that they're easier to pull off. I've kept everything a little loose, which helps. If your first row is tight, that's fine. You will learn as you do the return pass why you want it a little loose next time. And the return pass goes like this. I do a yarn over and draw through one loop just one time to get started. As a traditional crocheter, that really feels like a turning chain to me, but we don't tend to call it that in hybrid crochet. We just say yarn over and draw through one loop. Now the repeat is to yarn over and draw through 2 loops, which I'm going to do over and over till I'm at the end of the row. And if you want to do that and meet me at the end of the row, that's fine. All right, so now we're going to finish the return pass, and basically I keep doing the yarn over and draw through 2 loops till I can't do it anymore. I can still do it one more time, so I will. And now I can't because I only have 1 loop on my hook. So now we're ready for our row where I'm going to show you a few examples of each of the stitches that we're going to do and explain the names of them. First up, we're going to start with what's called the Tunisian simple stitch. It's the most basic stitch. It's one that you may already be familiar with, and it is going to be the body of our piece here. So all of this here is the simple stitch. Looks kind of like a gridded pattern, and it's often what people think of with this craft, but we're going to play with some other ones through the collection as well. So in general, we're going to skip the first vertical bar of the row, and that's because I already have a loop coming out of it. I'm going to insert my hook into the second vertical bar, and I'm going to insert it, since I'm right-handed, from right to left, kind of skimming the surface of the fabric as opposed to poking through it. And then I'm going to yarn over and draw up a loop. And as usual, you want to make sure these are a little loose on your hook. Your hook should be able to sit on top of the fabric. If it feels like it's stuck to the side of the fabric, that means that it's really too tight, and it'll not only be harder for you to crochet, but it's also going to cause the fabric to curl inwards more than it otherwise would. So nice loose loops if you can. I'm going to do that 3 more times just to show you. So I'm going to the very next vertical bar. I'm going to insert my hook from my right side to my left side since I'm right-handed, yarn over and draw up a loop, making sure it's loose and can sit on top of the fabric. So this again is called the Tunisian simple stitch. It is, as you can tell from the name, a pretty basic stitch. Now I'm going to do a few examples of the Tunisian knit stitch. And on the cowl and the scarf, we use that for the top edge, which pulls in a little bit to help shape the piece, and it also gives it a nice clean finish at the top. And for that one, instead of skimming the vertical bar, I'm actually going to insert my hook into the loop. Each vertical bar is actually part of a loop. I'm going to pull this one a little bigger so you can see. So there's a second part of it that's in the back, and I'm going to insert my hook between those, and my hook's going to go from front to back through the fabric. So there's a big chunk of fabric on top of my hook here, and I'm going to yarn over and draw up a loop through that. And again, for the next one, I'm going to find it. Now, if you have trouble seeing the loop itself, if you see it, that's great. If you have trouble seeing it, what you can do is insert your hook like you did for the simple stitch, and then turn it towards the back. It's going to get you to the same place, but for folks who have trouble with kind of the pattern recognition, that's a trick that'll get you there without having to see it in the same way. So hook goes into the loop, yarn over and draw up a loop onto my hook. I'm going to do one more of those. So that again is called the knit stitch, and it's a pretty cool one because it gives you a fabric that looks like stockinette stitch and knitting. Let me pull this so you can see a little bit more. So I've got 3 of those stitches here at the edge. This is actually the first time I heard of this craft. I was working at a yarn shop, and one of my regulars who only crocheted and adamantly only crocheted came in and showed me something she'd made. And before I touched it, I was like, oh my gosh, you're knitting. And she said, no, it's crochet. And I could tell when I touched it because it is a little thicker and squishier. But I made her sit down and show me how, because fascinating that with just a crochet hook, you can make a fabric that looks like stockinette stitch and knitting. So those are our basic stitches we're using. We also have to do some increases and some decreases for this pattern. So I'm going to show you the increases first because the increases come up first when you're making the project. And the increase I'm using here is an M1, which stands for a make 1 increase. There are some increases where you take one stitch and turn it into two. This is an increase where you don't use an actual stitch, you're making one in between the stitches. And the way I do that is find the bump on the very top. It's almost just a little bit towards the back side, so these little bumps here. And I'm going to insert my hook into the next bump. It's quite close to where I just came, and it's going to be a little tighter, so that's why it's nice that these hooks have a bit of a point. Ooh, this one is real tight actually. Let me wiggle it in. And then once I'm in there, I'm going to yarn over and draw up a loop. So that has made a stitch between my vertical bars. I haven't used them at all. And then I'm going to do one more simple stitch after that, since that's what's going to come after your M1 increases. I'm going to repeat that a couple times so you can see it again. So to do another M1, I'm going to rotate my fabric a little bit so I can see that bump at the top, and insert my hook into it. I've been working a little tight, I think, so I'm going to try to loosen up on my next row, and you probably have to as well, especially if you're having trouble getting in there. Yarn over and draw up a loop. That's my M1, my make one increase. And I'm going to do a simple stitch. Now in our project, we just do one make one at a time. Any increase row just has one, but I want to show you a few times so you can really see it and practice along with me. So there's my bump. I'm going to increase into it. If you need to use your other hand to kind of wiggle it in, feel free. Yarn over and draw up a loop. And another simple stitch. Now, if you're wondering whether you did your increase, because it's so easy to lose track, and I'm losing track just because I'm talking to you about other things at the same time, the M1 increases will look a little bit different. So this is my simple stitch here where I have my loop comes on top of this vertical bar. The M1s are tucked in between. So I've done it now 3 times. So there's a make one, here's my simple stitch, make one, simple stitch, make one, simple stitch. I'm going to do it one more time because I'm trying to show you everything 4 times for practice sake. So there's my bump at the top. I'm going to wiggle my hook into it, yarn over and draw up a loop, and then one more simple stitch. So those are increases. The way that the pieces are made will increase a lot, and then I'll work even for a bit, and then we'll decrease a lot. So the decreases here are a pretty easy one. They are a Tunisian simple stitch 2 together. The abbreviation is TSS2 TOG for together. So I'm going back to the simple stitch where I go into the vertical bars sideways. But here I'm going to go into 2 of them at once, and then yarn over and draw up a loop, and make sure you come out through both as well. So I've used 2 stitches on my existing fabric, 2 vertical bars, but I only have 1 loop on my hook, and you can see they kind of come together sort of like an upside down V. So to show you that again, you insert your hook into 2 vertical bars at once and yarn over and draw up a loop. Let's do it 2 more times. I like doing everything in 4s. Just to make sure you've got the chance to practice it. And you know what, something went wrong on mine. Oh, no, it didn't. I just wasn't looking at it very closely. No, something went wrong on mine. I've got an extra stitch here, so I'm just going to do the decrease 3 times. I probably miscounted. This isn't actually in the pattern. I made it up for the tutorial, so it is a little less tested. So I'm just going to do a simple stitch here because I don't want to decrease right at the end. That tends to make the edge kind of bump in an unpleasant way. I also really want to show you how I do the edge stitch here. Now for your last stitch, it might look a little loose. Don't worry about it. You could go through just the vertical bar at the edge, but I find I get a much nicer and more secure edge if I go through 2 strands. There are 3 strands of my stitch here between my thumbs, so I go to the 2 that are farther on the left, under both of them, and then as usual, yarn over and draw up a loop. So I've got kind of a wacky first row here because I've got 2 different basic stitches, a bunch of increases and a bunch of decreases. I'm not going to do the return pass on this because I'm going to show you the full rows, and we'll get to repeat the return pass quite a few times. So I've got a little sample here that I prepared. It currently has 10 stitches. We're going to end up increasing on it and decreasing it. It does have the basic pattern, so this is how the project starts. You can see we have our simple stitch for the body, our increases are a few stitches in, and we've got the knit stitch as the edging here on my left, which is the top edge of the piece. For keeping this safe while it was waiting for me, I put a stitch marker in, which is a nice trick to do, especially if you're down to just 1 loop on your hook. It's easy to have that fall off and things could come unraveled pretty quickly. The other option is to put things down when you have finished your forward pass and you've got lots of loops on your hook. So I'm going to start here by showing you the basic row, which we call a work even row. It means I'm not going to increase, I'm not going to decrease, I'm going to keep the same number of stitches that I have. I start with 1 loop on my hook. We skip the first bar because that loop already comes out of the first bar. Then I'm going to the second bar, I'm going to do a simple stitch. So I go in sideways through the bar, yarn over and draw up a loop. Same thing with the third stitch. And I'm going to keep doing this for my work even row until I have 3 stitches left. It's just simple stitch across most of them. As you do the project, this section gets longer and longer until you start decreasing, and then it gets shorter and shorter. So I'm going to stop here. I've got 3 stitches left, and you can see that the pattern has changed a little bit. Now, if you have a bit of trouble seeing what that looks like, you can always put a little clippy stitch marker in. I might do it like a row or 2 below where I'm working, and then move it up every once in a while, just as a visual and even a physical reminder that this is where things change. Sometimes people use those tricks when they're starting a project, and partway through you might not need it anymore because you can see what's happening a little bit more. But at the beginning, sometimes it's not very recognizable. So now for my last 3 stitches, I'm going to do the Tunisian knit stitch. So this is the one where I go through the fabric, so I'm going into that loop all the way to the back, and yarn over and draw up my loop. And then a second one. And then for the final stitch, it is technically a Tunisian knit stitch here, but as before, I'm going to go through 2 loops because I find that that gives the top edge a neater look. So I'm going under 2 strands and yarning over and drawing up a loop. And this is a point where you might want to count and just see how many loops you got in your hook. So I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, which is perfect. That's what I had on the previous row, and this row I didn't increase, I didn't decrease, so I still have 10. If you're new, it's really nice to count every once in a while just to know what's working. And then the return pass is the same as it was before and for all these projects. I'm going to yarn over and draw through 1 loop 1 time, and then yarn over and draw through 2 loops over and over and over until I can't do any more. And I'm going to remind myself to keep it a little bit loose so that when I need to do that M1 increase again, it is a little easier than it was on my sample. Chances are you need the same reminder as well. All right, so now I'm going to show you the increase row. And the way the increase row works, I'm going to do a few simple stitches here and then increase, simple stitches to the last 3, and then those are the knit stitch. I really like the pattern that you get here when the increases aren't right near the edge. You get like a little border that's happening. We call that fully fashioned shaping or fully fashioned increasing in this particular case. I like vocabulary, and I really like knowing the most right words for things. I didn't say that very well, which is actually really funny. The words are right, but the grammar is a little awkward. So here's my increase row. As usual, I'm skipping the first vertical bar. I'm going to go into the second one and yarn over and draw up a loop, and the third one as well. And then when I have 3, that's where my shaping is going to be happening. So I'm going to do my M1 increase. I rotate the fabric a little bit so I can see that bump on the top, slightly towards the back, but we call it the bump on the top. And I'm going to yarn over and draw up a loop. And then I'm going back to my simple stitch. And the first one I want is quite close to where I just did that make one. So it's actually really nice. It's a nice light colored one here so you can really see it. Careful you don't skip that, because if you skip that, you won't have actually increased because you would have added a stitch and lost a stitch and you'd still have 10 at the end, but you're going to check to find out. So through that nice close vertical bar, and I'm going to continue doing my simple stitch until I'm 3 from the end. I also have my bright pink marker there to remind me, and I can just feel it under my thumb, which is nice because I don't always look very closely at my work. So I can tell something's coming up. Here's my transition. And then I'm ready to do my knit stitches. So I go in through the fabric, draw up my loop, another one, and the last one, as usual, I'm going underneath 2. And again, the colors are lining up perfectly. It's hot pink at the end, so that is really letting you see how that's different from the strands before it. And we're going to count. So I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 now. And that's because my make one increase, which is the 4th one on the hook here, is my has added a stitch. And then I'm going to do my return pass, yarn over and draw through 1 loop, and then yarn over and draw through 2 loops to the end of the row. Now the way this pattern works, you're going to start with a whole lot of increases. And I'm going to pull over the scarf version so you can see how that works. Let's see, let's get the start end. So here's our start end. We start with just a few stitches and we are increasing, increasing, increasing for a long time. The bandana cowl is similar, but the increase rates are different and the pattern has the details that tell you what to do depending on your piece, but they both just start doing some increases. In the middle, you're going to work even for a little bit, which means we'll have some rows where the sizing doesn't change. And then in a while, you're going to do your decreases, and then we're going to decrease it down till it gets narrow again. Same thing on the cowl. This would be the ending that we decrease it in. So you don't have to do the decrease row for a while, and if you're feeling like your brain is already full with what I've shown you, you can just come back to this video when you get to the decrease section and look at it then. It's not hard to do though, so I'm going to go ahead and show you. So we start similarly. I skip the first vertical bar. I'm going to go into the second one and yarn over and draw up a loop. Now I'm going to do my decrease, which is a TSS2 together. So I'm going to go into the next 2 vertical bars at once, yarn over and draw up a loop. I've decreased, and you can see I still have my 3-stitch edge here because the decrease kind of tucks right into that really nicely. You could do the decrease farther in, but it wouldn't line up in the same way, and I wanted the border to be the same width the whole way. Then as usual, I'm going to continue doing my simple stitches until 3 stitches remain. And then I'm going to do my knit stitches at the end. So here's my knit stitch going in from front to back through the fabric into that loop, and then through 2 bars at the end. And now if I count, I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, I'm back to 10 because I've done my decrease. Now I'm doing this really fast. You wouldn't actually do an increase row followed by a decrease row on the pattern, but I do want you to just see how they work. Now the return pass is the same as it always has been. Yarn over and draw through 1 loop and then through 2 repeatedly. Now I want to talk a little bit about gauge. This is a rare time that I'm going to give you permission to not do a gauge swatch, but I do think you still want to check your gauge because it can affect how much yarn you use as well as the finished size of the piece. So I'm going to move this aside and pull over. I'm actually going to pull over this one because it's a little easier to see because there's a lot of stitches on here. I suggest you start your project. If you know you're a really tight crocheter, try to loosen up, but also use a bigger hook if you need to. If you know you're a really loose crocheter, use a smaller hook. I would go ahead and start your piece and get a little ways in, right where you start thinking, oh cool, I got this. I know what's happening. I know the rhythm of it. Take a break. You might want a body break too to see if you need a stretch or a wiggle. Always good to remind yourself to do that when you're crafting. Sometimes it's so exciting that you just keep going and going and going, and that is not good for you. But also it's a great time to stop and just take a look at it. Make sure that you like the way that the fabric looks. If it's curling a lot, you're probably working too tight. You also check on your gauge. So you can take your tape measure and count your stitches. And in crochet, it's interesting because for a lot of our stitches, we have the stitch that we notice at first and then a space next to it. And I want to make sure that you always think of counting both of those as a stitch. So here I've got my vertical bar, but I wouldn't count 1 stitch done till I get to the next vertical bar. So I'm going to go ahead and count, see what I've got here. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Actually, I'm going to do this. I'm going to switch tools. Instead of my big thumb, I'm going to use a little darning needle so you can see a bit better where I'm pointing. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And it's not quite all the way to 9. 9 would be at the beginning of this. I would say this is 8.5 stitches in 2 inches. In most patterns, you give the gauge in 4 inches, so I'd multiply that by 2, which is 17, which happens to be exactly what we want for this particular project. As with a lot of projects, the stitch gauge matters a bit more than the row gauge, but it never hurts to check your row gauge, especially because it can really affect how much yarn that you use. If you've got tighter rows, you'll need more yarn to finish the project. If it's by length, which this particular one is. If you have looser rows, you still might take more yarn to finish the project if it is by row. So whether you have tight or loose rows, you might run out of yarn. So for that, it's a good idea just to go ahead and check. So here again, let me switch hands so you can see. I'm going to count the vertical bars. So this would be 1 row, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is getting close to 6. And it never hurts to move your tape measure and check somewhere else and see what you've got there. So that's more like 5.5. And I'm going to check my bandana cowl as well because I know when I made this, the scarf relaxed a little bit more vertically. I think I'm going to get a slightly different gauge here, which is interesting, even though it's the same yarn. Yep, so here I've got a few more rows per inch. It doesn't matter too much with this project, but it is something that's good to start thinking about as you head towards things that need to fit a bit more precisely. So the last thing I need to show you with a crochet hook before we talk about finishing is how to do the last row. And this is true with hybrid crochet in general. The top row doesn't look great. And when you're crocheting it, this actually might make you feel bad thinking that it looks messy on the top row. Basically, the row you just finished isn't done until you do something on top of it. And normally that's the next row and the next row and the next row, and it keeps building. But here at the end, I wouldn't want to finish it like this. It doesn't look great. So we're going to work single crochet across the edge. And this is a traditional single crochet. For those of you who already do traditional crochet, you're familiar with it. For everyone else, it is not hard. Basically, on this row, I'm not going to end up with a lot of loops on my hook. I'm going to finish each stitch and always end up with 2 at the most in the middle of a stitch, but 1 when I'm done. As usual, I'm going to skip the first stitch. And here I'm going to insert my hook as if I'm doing the knit stitch into the loop, yarn over and draw up a loop. I now have 2 loops on my hook. That's the most I'm ever going to have, because I'm then going to yarn over and draw through both of those loops to finish my single crochet. And I'm going to do this across the row. So I insert my hook, yarn over and draw up a loop. Here I have 2. I'm halfway through this stitch, yarn over and draw through both loops. As always, try to keep it a little bit loose. People tend to get a bit nervous at the very beginning and end of a project and make it real tight at those edges. And for this project, it doesn't matter too much, but for some things like hats or sweaters, you can have something that can't get over your head because you pulled that beginning or ending row super duper tight. You can always stop and check too and give it a little stretch. So I'll do this through the whole row. I'm already inserting my hook as if I'm doing the knit stitch. So when I get to the stitches that I normally do that, I'm going to just keep doing the same thing. And as usual, on the last stitch of the row, I like to go underneath 2 strands. And you can see this looks so much nicer and neater at the top edge than it did before. It looks like it's a finished thing. Then we're going to cut the piece, and if you are doing the scarf, you just need a few inches to weave it in. If you're doing the cowl, there's a teeny tiny seam, so I might leave a few more, maybe do like 8 inches instead of 3 or 4. And to tie it off, I usually just do this with my crochet hook. You could make the loop big and thread the tail through, but I've already got a hook in my hand, so I usually just do a yarn over, and this one time I pull the whole thing through, and there is my finished piece. Obviously, it is not the shape you're really making. It's just a funny little triangular sample, but you can see the details of the edges on there. Now, when you're done the crochet part of it, I think there's still a really important step, which is blocking. Blocking makes everything look better. And with the amount of time that you put into blocking compared to the amount of time crocheting the thing, and this is true if you knit as well, it is such a minimal effort and it makes a really big difference. So all you're going to do is take your piece, and you might notice that it's kind of curling up a little bit like this. If you're worked really tight, it might curl even more, and you're going to want to try to loosen up next time. I'm going to give it a bath. So I just put this in a bowl or a sink full of water. You don't need soap, but if you thought it got grimy, like if you took it with you camping, put a little soap in. Normally though, you just want to get it wet. Let it hang out a bit. If it's floating, like give it a squish, push it down so it's totally wet, and then take it out. I like to just press out the water, and then I'll usually use a towel, or for this I would use a little washcloth, and roll it up in the towel to wick out a lot of the moisture, and then lay it flat to dry. This particular project, you don't need to pin it and pull and block it under tension, but I do have a great trick. So see how this fabric likes to curl upwards? When I block it face down, because the shape of the piece against the table helps uncurl it. You could put a few pins in if you need to, maybe just in the corners, but I find with the weight of the water in there, it just stays where it is. Doesn't look as pretty as if you block it face up, but functionally it's going to help it lay flat when you're using the project later on. And just let it dry. Depending on how much water's still in there and what your weather is, could be an afternoon, could be a couple of days if you've got a lot of storms happening and there's a lot of moisture in the air. For the scarf, then you just need to tuck in the yarn tails. For the bandana cowl, though, there is a little teeny tiny seam. It's only a few stitches. And there are 2 ways that you can do the seam. You can either sew it with a whip stitch, or you can crochet it with a slip stitch. So I'm going to show you how to do both of those, and I'm just going to do a funny little seam on my sample here because it's already a funny sample and in mine as well. I'm going to do the crochet version first because it's going to be easier for me to pull out so I can show you the other one. I did not leave a very long tail for myself, but that's okay because I'm only going to do a few stitches. Now on the project, these would be even. You'd have a few stitches here and a few stitches there. I'm just going to do the first couple so you can see. So I want to do this with the right sides facing. So the nice sides, or the right sides or the outsides, should be next to each other. And I'm going to hold it with my long yarn tail towards my dominant hand so that yarn's ready for me to crochet. And I'm going to insert my hook under the V of the first stitch on the piece that's closer to me, and then the V of the first stitch on the piece that's farthest from me. And I usually wait to get my yarn tension because that was a little awkward to get in, and I wanted all my fingers free for it. And then I'm going to yarn over and pull that loop through everything. And then I'm going to repeat. So I'm going to insert my hook into the V on the front, and then the V on the back, and yarn over and pull through everything, including my starting loop. This is a slip stitch, and it's a nice one for seaming. So I'm going to do this just on out of stitches on the shorter piece, and I'm going to show you what it looks like, and then I'll show you the whip stitch, and you can decide what you want to do. When I'm done with a slip stitch seam, I just tie it off the same way I did when I was crocheting before. Now this is a super strong seam, and sometimes that's just what you want. When we get to the top, that's what we're definitely going to do for the top. It does give you a bit of a ridge of a seam allowance here, and on the outside, gosh, I made like a tiny little doll cowl. On the outside, it looks pretty nice and neat, but it does have that ridge. Now, if you want to seam it with a needle instead, or if you don't want a ridge, and if you're very, very lucky, your two desires line up to get you to the same technique, I'm going to pull this out and show you how you could seam it with a whip stitch, which is a sewing technique. Whip stitch is not a super strong seam, but it doesn't give you a ridge of a seam allowance. So if you have something that isn't load bearing, so if it isn't a big heavy sweater or a blanket, it can be a good choice and is pretty quick and easy to do. So I've threaded up my yarn on my darning needle, and I am going to insert my hook underneath the V. I still have this right sides together. So my needle is now going in exactly where my hook went. I just called it a hook, didn't I? Insert my needle under the V's on each side, pull it through. If you have other yarn tails, just tuck them out of your way. I'll show you how I deal with them in a minute. And again, into the V on the front, V on the back, pull it through. Now this is a rare time that I'm going to tell you can pull things tight, because it actually does look better with a whip stitch if you yank on it a little bit. And those of you who've been working really hard to be loose this whole time might be happy to have permission to do something tight. And when I'm finishing whip stitch, I often will do the last stitch a second time to make it a little bit stronger. And you can see with this seam, it's a little bit more noticeable, partially because I happen to be on a bright green section of my yarn, which happens sometimes, but there's no ridge. It's really, really nice and flat. And on the outside, it looks pretty similar. If this happened to be a gray piece of yarn, it would probably look a little bit neater because that green is catching my eye. But we've got flashes of green and purple and blue all over the place, so it's really not going to be noticeable in the long run. All right, so the last thing I need to show you is how to tuck in the yarn tails. And I also like doing that with a darning needle or a tapestry needle. There are different methods, so if you have another method that you already use, feel free, but I'm going to show you what I like to do. And the key to mine is that I change direction to help keep the yarn from working its way out. I'm not a fan of burying the yarn tails in a seam or near the edges. I like to have them in the piece with a couple of direction changes. So I'm going to start somewhere near where my yarn's coming out, but make sure I don't poke in exactly where it's coming out there. And for this particular one, the back of this fabric looks a lot to me like the back of knitted fabric, whether it's stockinette or garter stitch. So I tend to do the same thing I do there, which is working on the diagonal. So I'm going to insert my hook into this bright pink, my needle into the bright pink one here, and then come over so that each time I'm putting my needle in, it's the next thing that's both over a little and in this case down a little. It's going to be roughly a 45-degree angle, but it depends a little bit on what stitch you're going into. The important part is that my needle is very much covered on yarn here and it doesn't poke through the other side. I can tuck as my hands in there, but you can also turn it to peek if you want to. If I saw a big flash of silver needle here, I would have gone in a place that's not ideal because then my yarn I'm tucking in would poke to the other side. And invariably it's going to be another bright green or bright pink section. So I'd usually do this about, 5 or 6 or 7 bumps or about ½ an inch. I stopped here because I'm running out of real estate. I'm too close to the edge. I'm going to pull it through just till there's no extra. This is not a time to pull tight. And the important part is I'm going to change direction. So now I'm going to change direction. I'm going to head up kind of right next to where I was, Again, keeping this diagonal as best I can. I do have my increases and decreases here, so sometimes that makes it a little harder. So just make a judgment call. If you can't see the needle very much here and it's not poking through the other side, you're probably just fine. Now 2 passes is probably plenty, but if you have a loose fabric or slippery yarn, or you know it's going to get washed and dried a lot, or if you're just nervous, go ahead and do a 3rd pass. It can't hurt anything, and if it makes you feel more secure about cutting off the yarn tail, absolutely do a 3rd pass. Now, I'm going to show you, as we do different projects, I'm going to change the direction on how I tuck in the yarn tails, especially when you get to lace where you have holes to navigate around. So it won't always be this direction, but I will always have some direction changes where I turn. And then you can cut off whatever's still sticking out. I personally don't leave tails. I know some people like to leave a 1/2 inch or so. You can do that, again, if it makes you feel secure. But I find that this works well. It's really hard to see that woven in end on the inside. And then I don't see it at all on the outside, which is even more important. And because it's on the diagonal, I still have some stretch to the fabric. And with the direction changes, it's really less likely to wiggle its way out. You can get kits for this at the link below or at MissouriQuiltCo.com. And I hope you have fun with the project. You can make a lot of these scarves or cowls for your family, or a whole rainbow just for yourself if you want to. It's a fun way to play with color and to build your skills. And then I'll see you for the next episode for the chevron blanket. All right, thanks for crocheting with me.